Okay, now we're recording. So hi, most of you know me as Ashley because that's pretty much what my SCA name is right now. We'll change that in November, maybe. And of course, this is the Ainu history, culture, and clothing class. It's kind of 50-50. It's 50 history and culture and 50 clothing. So I just labeled it as a history class when I registered this class. So when you guys register your class credits, put it as history. So I want to give a quick disclaimer. This is going to probably have some curse words. I know that there's some mention of genitalia. Um, there's also conversations about cultural genocide, not people genocide, cultural genocide, two different things, and racism. And we'll get into that in the next couple of slides. So I did try to edit myself while doing this, and I realized by taking out some of these topics that you're really not getting the point of the culture, um, or like the cultural aspects that the Ainu have. And there's some pretty fun stuff. So, warning for anybody who might be watching this on YouTube later, this may not be kid friendly, and your discretion is advised. So, first off, who are the Ainu? The Ainu are a Siberian group that are found primarily now in Hokkaido, but their traditional homeland includes Sakhalin Island, the Kuril Islands, the Kamchatka, sorry, Russian words, Kamchatka Peninsula, and as I said, Hokkaido. And due to Russian policies and removal, as well as conquest, the Ainu are now confined primarily in Hokkaido. There is a few on the peninsula on Sakhalin Island, but there's no Ainu on the Kuril Islands anymore. And the reason for that is on the Kuril Islands, there was a disease that primarily wiped them out. And with the Russian policy, they actually force um, those on the peninsula and Sakhalin Island to move into Hokkaido. So that's where you're primarily going to see the Ainu today, even though they have a much more diverse, span of where they used to be. And there were some more around the Amur, oh gosh, Amur River, which same as the Tigers, the Amur River. Um, but they were not permanent settlements. They were primarily trading settlements. So they were never fully on the mainland, other than on the peninsula, of course. So here's a bit of a culture breakdown. The language they speak is called Ainu as well. It's considered an language isolate. There's no known other languages that are very similar to Ainu. We are very confident that they are a Siberian group, because that's where the genetics are pointing. But there's not even the languages that they had language contact with are similar to Ainu at all. They don't traditionally have a writing system. They do now. You'll find it either in Japanese katakana or in Roman characters. And again, there's not a lot written down historically about them. So what sources we do have historically for them are, from the Chinese, from the Mongols, from the Japanese, from the Koreans. And so all these other groups who had written language were writing about them, but they did not have a traditional source of writing. And of course, even today with their current writing system, there's a lot of complications with understanding. If it's not in the Roman characters, if it's in the katakana instead, it's kind of difficult to read. And I've attempted to read as someone who knows how to read Japanese katakana. Um, Traditional beliefs are animistic. They would call, which is of course the belief that they're spirits and everything. They would call these spirits particularly kamui. Um, and the most important kamui were the bear, the wolf, the owl, and the salmon kamui. And they would have festivals and sacrifices relating around them. And we'll go a little more into the bear and a bit into the salmon. But those were the top four, probably most important kamui to them. Traditionally, it was a hunter-gatherer society, but they did have rice development and there was cultivation and farming on a small scale. It was more of a backyard garden kind of scale, so it wasn't really that large. And we'll talk a little bit about what they did cultivate and stuff when they get into talking about food. They first appear in written record in 1591, and it was a Latin text called De Ezu Rum Insula. And of course, I don't speak any Latin. I speak Asian languages more than I speak Latin, which is kind of interesting because the Japanese name for Hokkaido was originally Ezo, but if you look at more older writings, especially in Western form, it did have that Y. So I'm pretty sure it basically says something along the lines of Ezo Island. Um, so it's talking particularly about Hokkaido itself, which is kind of cool. Um, and the other thing to note about them is they're a minority group in Japan. They're one of three ethnic groups of Japan. You have the Ryukyu, um, which is also known as Okinawa. I prefer Ryukyu because that is the traditional name for the people. You can also say Luchu, which was the Chinese name, and it's a little more proper than saying Okinawa or the Okinawans because that's an island, not a group of islands like the Ryukyu are. So it's not even really talking about the people of the Ryukyu. But the Ainu is, of course, other than the main Japanese population, is the other group. And they are the only official minority group recognized in Japan. And they weren't recognized until about 2008. So I was graduating high school before they even got recognized as a minority group. And of course, because of assimilation practices up until this point, they lost a lot of their culture. There's no one who speaks native Ainu anymore. It is considered, it's not an extinct language because there are people who speak it, but they do not speak it as their first language. And as a side note, if anybody has any questions, of course, you are welcome to stop me and be like, hey, can you tell me more about this? Um, I mostly specialize in later Japanese Ainu history, um, mostly from Edo period onwards. And every time I got a chance to talk about it when I was in school, I got to talk about these guys because I could. They said write a paper. Great, I'm going to talk about the Ainu. So DNA history, because this is one of those things that a lot of people get fascinated about is about the DNA history. Um, we do know that they share a lot of maternal chromosomes with Siberian people. I think it's about 51%. And the other percent is probably an admixture between the traditional Jomon people and actually traditionally and regular Japanese people. Part of the cultural assimilation practices involved intermarriage with the native Japanese people to the south. And so there's a lot of mixture. And I don't know what groups were doing the DNA test on. So I can't say, oh, hey, all these bodies testing back, pre-Edo period, we're all testing to have this type of Y chromosome DNA. I don't know what bodies they were testing for this particular one, but there's a mixture, of course. They're also, to make these guys interesting, up into the 1800s, there were just reports of Ainu having light colored hair and eyes, like blonde hair and blue eyes, which is really interesting. Of course, you're not going to see that with the Japanese mixing in now, because everybody looks very Japanese in their appearance, but they are Siberian people, so it gets kind of cool. We do know that there is some relation with Native American cultures. In fact, there's a lot of studies both in DNA and in just like cultural studies, like what do they have similar, what do they have different. For example, Kennewick Man, if you ever get a chance to study Kennewick Man from, guess what, Kennewick, Washington, where I'm from, he was connected to the Ainu through DNA, which is fun. And if you ever guys ever want me to go on that rant, because I will go on that rant so hard, and all the things people get wrong about Ken McMahon. But that's for a later conversation. Another thing that kind of distinguishes the Ainu versus Japanese um, is that Ainu grow with these full-on beards, like this dude right here. Um, Regular Japanese don't typically get such a full beard. And that beard's very culturally significant to the Ainu. And we're going to actually talk about the story about female Ainu and their tattoos, kind of relating to this beard a little bit later. Um, but yeah, that's just about their DNA history and what kind of makes them unique to the Japanese. I do want to make a clarification. I mentioned the Jomon period, the Jomon people. The Jomon people were an ancient people before the Yamato came to Japan. The Yamato were a group of basically what we consider now Japanese. So the current Japanese are the Yamato that actually came from Korea about 3,000 years ago. And so that's when I say Jomon, I'm talking about the people pre that Korean group that came over. Most Japanese today are of Korean descent, technically. Only about 20 to 30% of their DNA is Jomon. Um, so we can go on a whole discussion about prehistory and Japanese and Jomon period and all that kind of stuff. But let's go ahead and keep going on the Ainu subject. So their biggest religion is the cult of the bear. And the bear is very significant to the Ainu people. And what they typically would do about with the cult of the bear ceremonies is they would typically find an orphan cub, like maybe they killed the mom or something like that, or they found a deceased female bear. They would adopt that cub, and for about 2 years, that cub was a member of a household, and it was treated essentially as if it was a human child and treated significantly well, even to the point that it may have been better than some of the kids in the family, you know. When that bear would reach 2 years old, it would then be ritually sacrificed. And part of the ceremony, and you can see in this picture, would be dancing. They would actually kill the bear and they would also sing while they were dancing. There was also a small feast at the end, primarily for the elders of the community. When it comes to the naming culture, and this is where I put that disclaimer for a reason. Um, I knew young children and babies did not have names. So if you're under 6, you didn't actually have a name. You were kind of given a nickname until you turned the age of 6. And the reason for that is they didn't want bad spirits or kamui to bring disease, particularly to that child. So they would kind of give the child vulgar names in response, and you would have names like pile of shit or grandpa's butthole or penis. And that's what they would call the child until they were 6 years old. Once the child was 6, they would kind of pick their name based on either the personality of the child or they would do it based on how they're contributing to society or to themselves. Like if the child is particularly smart, they would give them a name about being smart. If the child was particularly, strong, the name would be based on how strong this child. But as I said, that was why I gave the disclaimer because, as I said, they call those little kids and babies like some of the most vulgar names. Um, I saw one that said grandma's boob, for example, on what they would give a child their name for. So they also had a pretty decent, rich musical and dancing culture. So some of the names of instruments we know is the mokuri, which was a mouthpiece, and it's that picture right at that bottom. They would basically be brought up to the mouth and they would hold it on the handle part, and with the string part they would pull it and they would use their mouth to fluctuate and make noise. And it's a pretty cool instrument. I think it's one of those things anybody could learn because it's just it's just like a harmonica. So supposedly if you work hard at it and practice a lot, you can pretty well. The one on the other side is a tonkori, which is a string instrument. It kind of reminds me sort of like a small koto, but it was held up high and it was, usually half flapped over the shoulder and, plucked. They also had a kako, which is a tambourine-like instrument. And if you ever listen to any Ainu performances, you can usually hear it in the background. They also had a wind instrument, which was kind of like a lute, or a clarinet, where it was flowing downwards. They also are famous for throat singing. And if you ever get a chance to hear throat singing, it's such a fun little experience. Um, and some of their music that they would play, like the songs and lyrics they would have, were based on poetry or their epics. So when they were speaking their epics, they were actually singing them. And there are translations in English of the epics. We'll talk about this one sort of later, but I'll just give a little insert from the song of the song that Owl God sang. And this is a pretty famous book. It's pretty short if you ever get a chance to read it. And I'll just do like a little section. And remember, this would have been sung. And I tried playing around with this idea about, bardic arts and actually trying to sing this, and I was like, nope, at the end of it. But this is just the first stanza. Silver drops fall all around, gold drops fall all around. I sang as I gilded above the stream and over the village, and I passed as I glazed down. Those who had been poor had become rich, and those who had been rich are now poor. It seemed on the beach, human children playing with toy arrows and toy bows. Silver drops fall all around, gold drops fall around. I sang as I flew over the children, and they ran below me and said, and that's just like the first stanza of this poem. There's unfortunately not a lot of Ainu literature that's translated, and this is one of the few that has been. And it's kind of cool just to read through if you ever get a chance. As I said, it's a pretty short book, but it's worth a read. And I do have a copy of it, so those who are in my Schreier, if you ever want to borrow it, I have a copy. So in terms of the food, the most common foods in terms of meat were deer and fish. You wouldn't eat bear, owl, wolf, and wolf particularly. Those ones were a little more on the sacred side. That does not mean they weren't hunted or anything like that, but the food did not the food part of it did go to waste. They would maybe save like the fur and stuff like that, um, and use that in clothing or in sacred rites. But they didn't keep the bear or the wolf or the owl meat at all. In terms of cultivation, we do know they had some cultivation starting in the 12th century. There were turnips, beans, millet, and rice available. As I said, those were in small quantities and mostly, little garden that they would have in the outback for each family. Most of the diet came from foraging, as most hunter-gatherer societies do. And they would go out and find different plants. Like I know that they ate butterbur, and we'll talk a little bit about butterbur later. The two probably most well-known dishes they had with the chip tap, and that's basically a very fine tartared meat. It was kind of the consistency of ground beef, but it was also very paste-like, and that was traditionally eaten raw. But we do have examples more modernly where it's cooked just to kind of go with Western taste or the Japanese taste as they, started coming into Hokkaido. The other one that we have is Hoya stew, and that's just a meat stew with vegetables. And the picture that we have in front of us is actually that stew. So as far as the folklore goes, they have a very rich oral folklore, and it mainly focused on morals. And some of those themes that we frequently would see was about trade, or we have characters whose parents died, and sometimes there was a bit of I gotta go revive them. Sometimes, the parents stay dead. A lot of animals show up in folklore as well as nature. And here's my favorite little creatures in the folklore, the Korporkur. If you watch Shaman King, Horo Horo, um, his spirit, Kororo, is based off of this group of people. In fact, this picture is actually from Shaman King. And the translation for their name basically is little people under the butterbur. And for those pokey people, you probably heard of butterbur the restaurant. It's an actual plant, and you can kind of see this plant right here is a butterbur plant, and they get huge, and they're literally all over Hokkaido. When I was in Hokkaido, like I was traveling between Chitos Airport and Sapporo, and they were just lining the roadways. They were all over the place. So they're a pretty common plant. The Kolpukur, the best way to describe them, other than being obviously like a fairy type people, they're kind of similar to leprechauns, where if you caught one, there was a form of luck or treasure that you could have. Um, when but you also could be tricked to be letting them go, so you had to be careful not to let them go before they gave you the treasure. So just a brief overview of the history, and we're only going up to the 17th century. I kind of mentioned about colonialization for the rest of the, because that's a huge theme for the rest of them. But as I mentioned, they are believed to be the original Jomon people in partial, with a lot of Siberian mixture. And there is some relationship between them and the native Ryukyu people in terms of the DNA. But I haven't really read too much into that research yet, so I don't want to say too much. But some things are suggestion. As I said, the Yamato people are what we consider Japanese today, and those guys are technically Koreans who came to Japan um, and settled in Japan as well. So when you ever hear the Yamato, you're thinking, traditional classic Japanese image right there. As I said, there's not a lot of mixture with this conquest, other than what you see more recently with the conquest of the Ainu in Hokkaido and the assimilation practices that go on. So a lot of the stories believe that the Jomon people were pushed northward, and they believe that the Emishi are related to the Ainu, and there's no relation to the Emishi or the Ainu so much, other than mostly trading practices. The Emishi are Yamato themselves. So if you hear someone say, "Oh, the Emishi or the Ainu or the Emishi or the Jomon," no, they're Yamato. They're Yamato all the way. They were just kind of outcasted a little. I've also heard other groups also claim not to be Yamato, but they're all Yamato. There's only the three groups in Japan. So first record we have them. In terms of actual, physical, like we're sure that this is them. In 1263, they did submit to the Mongols as they continue their conquest. And we're talking more of the those that were settled in Sakhalin and those trading in the Amur River Valley. There was, submission, and they were giving gifts a fealty to the Mongols during this time. Same with the Ming. The Ming also, once the Ming took over, the Ainu had to, subject themselves to the Ming, though they were never fully subjected. I do want to point this out, that they're very independent in how they were living. From here, we see scrolls and squirrels were introduced as symbolism into the Ainu's people's culture. And you can kind of see it on this guy on the far side. His outfit has some of the squirrels and circles. The outfits these guys are wearing are probably a little more of a ceremonial, other than the guy who's kind of puffing his chest out like, yeah, what's up? He's outfit's probably a little more less formal. In 1635 is when the Japanese started subjugating the Ainu in Hokkaido. And smallpox was introduced to Ainu at this time. Smallpox did have a pretty decent impact on them, and it did wipe about 10%, I think, of the population, 10 to 30%. Obviously, there was no records of how many people were living in Hokkaido at this time, so it's a guesstimate of how much were killed at this point. In 1644, we had the Qing period begin, and it's noting that that there was trade between the two groups, particularly. The Qing dynasty got furs. In return, the Ainu got silk. We do know that linen, hemp, and cotton were also traded amongst them. But if you have any of those four items coming from the Qing, they were typically, ceremonial garb. And so it was, reserved specifically for the really nice days. Maybe you were going to go sacrifice the bear and you had to go put on your nice robe. So we'll talk now about the clothing and beauty practices. starting with the beauty. So once an Ainu man came of age, they did not shave anymore. They grew on those full-on beards. And so having that beard was considered very beautiful and as well as sacred. Like a lot of cultures have a, think about shaving and not shaving for religious purposes. The other thing that we have is there's a huge tattoo culture, particularly among women. Men didn't usually get tattoos. It was primarily women. So the two people on the screen, they're both ladies. And you can tell that they're both ladies specifically because they have tattooing around their mouth. At the age of 6, they would start with a dot in their upper lip. And then as they age and they had life achievements and experiences, that dot would become bigger and bigger, and they would eventually get on this full-on lip tattoo. Um, and it was, a sign of not only that you have come into womanhood, but it was also a protection against evil spirits. There's a story about them that says that the Ainu women were so jealous of men that they had to tattoo their face so they could have their own, beards and mustache. And so I don't believe that's quite true, but that's a story that goes around that, says that, talks about the story of the tattooing. Tattoos on the hand, though, were common for both genders. As I said, it was primarily women who got tattoos and not men. And these tattoos were called anchipiri, sorry. So in terms of clothing, if you look at these shoes, they're magnificent, of course. They're made of salmon skin, actually. And salmon skin was one of the items they used. Primarily, it was used for shoes themselves. It wouldn't be used for much else, maybe a coat every once in a while. Traditional clothing, though, was mostly made out of tree bark, particularly that of birch, linden, and elm. And as I said, that was probably your daily wear, with the silk, linen, hemp, and cotton being more for that formal wear. During the winter, they would incorporate furs to help keep them warm. And they would also use deerskin as leggings, and leggings were used not only to keep them warm, but to protect their legs while they were foraging. You also have shoes made of dog hair as well. And you see a lot of colors in modern Ainu clothing. They would incorporate greens, but some of the older stuff you don't see any green. You'll typically see reds, blues, and bluish purples, as well as white, tan, yellows, and browns. And here's a picture of a Ainu garb. There's not really any like drop outlines that I've found for Ainu garb, but the sleeve was traditionally two parts. You had an upper and lower sleeve, and I like this one because you can see if you looked on my screen, it's on my left-hand side. I'm pretty sure it's left for you guys, but you can see the sleeve is actually two pieces. There's kind of that traditional like rectangular piece, and then there's like a huge gore on the second part. And that's how they would do the sleeves. You can also see down the middle that there is a seam down it, and that's because when they're weaving, the total fabric is not that wide, so you'd have to have that seam down the middle, as well as, of course, the collar. It's kind of probably reminds you of Japanese clothing, except for the collar piece drops a little further down as well, and the sleeves are completely different. But it's fairly similar to what you would see with a kosode or kimono. They also had a huge embroidery culture, and they also used appliques a lot. So all that design on there is embroidery and applique. The one on the bottom, of course, is going to be the applique. The one on top is the embroidery. And we'll get a little into embroidery, not so much the applique, but there's a lot of designs and motifs that they would use with their clothing. Here's a couple of more. The one on the left is from the 19th century. The one on the right, the headband, that one's a little more modern. And as you see, it's very colorful compared to maybe the older pieces. As I said, I've seen green in some of the more modern stuff. I don't see green in the older stuff, so I'm hesitant to say that it existed just because I haven't seen examples. I also like the robe on the left because that you can better see where that sleeve has that huge gore piece. You can tell that the stripes are different, but they were, all woven in together, obviously. And this collar is a little different. This has a shorter collar, but it was all traditional clothing. They would also wrap this around their body, kind of like a kimono, um, but like a hanfu at the same time. Like it's very linear, like hanfu, not crossed over. They had, of course, gloves, and here's a picture of the in and outs of the glove. These were also used for protection and keeping warm. Um, they were also used for like archery to help protect the hands from getting damaged when you're, pulling an arrow. This one's a little more modern. If you look on the picture on the right side, you can see that has a clip-in. I'm trying to remember the word now. It's a modern piece, but they did not have it. They would traditionally use the wrap that they have for wrapping around the wrist. They would not have any modern tools to it, and then of course they would have the finger pieces to hold on to as well. And we know that all I've shown you so far, most of it has not been ceremony because this guy is hunting. Ceremonial garb and regular everyday garb are very similar. They were very highly decorated, no matter if it was a ceremonial piece or not. There's just a few differences. You can tell it's more ceremonial by how much of the decoration aspect of it, how much embroidery, how much applique it has. Typically, with the more ceremonial stuff, you'll see full embroidery and applique all through the back, whereas there might be a gap with less ceremonial stuff. So here's some pictures of some ceremonial garb as well. This apron piece was very ceremonial. It also was a great way to find out if you're related to a girl. A lot of families would have the same, all the females would wear the same design if they were from the same matrilineal line. So if you saw that, oh, hey, she's from my mother's family line. I probably should not hit on her. So that was some of the fun stuff. They had jewelry, of course, beading, and then usually a medallion towards the end of a beaded necklace. They would also have cloth necklaces, like the one that's shown more towards the top. That was traditionally used more for married women. It's kind of like it's kind of the equivalent of an engagement ring. And then, of course, the gentleman over here, now that we're done talking about this lady, usually, with the exception of winter, usually vests were used for ceremonial. They would also use those vests in winter to keep warm, obviously. The headband was also another sign of an elder, so that was more ceremonial, as well as, anything they would put over. There's not really any garb that survives or any artwork as well. All of Ainu artwork kind of can be put down into three categories. Either it's woven art, like clothing, it's wood art, so like they would, go and chip wood and turn it into like a statuette or something like that, or it was metal. So we do have examples of metal surviving, but they don't show like the beautiful designs as much, in my opinion. I might be a little biased. I love the clothing. Um, but they won't show you the beautiful designs that they had. In addition, I forgot the sheaths that they would put it in the swords and daggers into, those were all wood, so obviously they degraded off over time. So there's not a lot of surviving stuff that's particularly old. Most of what we know about them, is more modern. So here we go into the embroidery and applique stuff. I got some good pictures pretty close up so you can kind of see this. Designs are usually created with applique and embroidery. You don't really see just embroidery and just applique. The only time I see just one or the other is usually on those the headbands that they wore, and usually that one will just have embroidery and not always have applique. The common stitches that they were using were the back stitch, the whip stitch, the chain stitch, and those are the three most common ones. But they also have a stitch named after them. There's called the Ainu running stitch, and I haven't seen any examples at all of them using the Ainu running stitch. At least up close, because there might still be them in there, but I haven't seen any. But apparently it exists. I found that out today, so I had to quickly add that in. The thread that they were used was usually that same wood material, like the birch, elm, linden tree bark stuff, or it was made out of nettle. Embroidery designs were also considered an emblem, kind of like, used for protection. So that way, there was always protection within you on some part of you, which is kind of interesting. And if you're a woman, extra protection because you have the tattoos as well. So here's some of them. I'm going to show you more, but there's a couple of motifs. I'm only talking about these ones because I know what these ones are. They're very pictographic. So for example, on the bottom, you see that this started out as a fish and then it goes into this twig looking thing. And it's very similar to Chinese characters. Chinese characters start out, looking more what they're trying to represent and going into more pictographic form. The one right under the word, my little, pictographic word, that one is actually pretty fun. That was the first one I learned, and that one's actually a symbol of an owl god, so an owl community. Owls, as I said, were very sacred, and you'll see this type of symbol quite frequently. The sheik motif right here, that is actually an eye, so that's a symbol of an eye. I unfortunately don't know all of them, but I know a couple, so I can like, oh hey, this one's pretty interesting. Here's some more. As I said, I don't know all of them. So you can see that the eyes, there's a couple that look like eyes here, but they're not eyes. And a couple look that kind of resemble the owl as well as on here. Most of the ones at the bottom I do know are all plant-based. I don't know which plants to try to symbolize, but they're very swirly. The Ainu love their swirls and their points and stuff like that. And it's just really pretty. I just like staring at Ainu clothing all day and be like, I want to make that one day. Eventually I will. Eventually I will, I promise. So here's a close-up view of some Ainu embroidery as well as applique. They would pretty much just sew on the applique directly onto the clothes and then do embroidery on top of that. A lot of the embroidery also has these multicolor options. Some of them have 3 colors that they would layer against each other. And as you can see those owl eyes right under this guy's hand, unfortunately. And of course, a couple of the regular eyes, because I see an eye above the owl eyes and then an eye below the owl eyes and on each side. And here's another one. Here's another really good one, just mostly applique, because you can see that the it's not embroidered, it's just sewn directly on. So I thought that one's kind of pretty and unique. So I'm going to talk about resources now. There is a bunch of free resources for Ainu stuff. So the ones that I have on here are either free or I've read them, so I can say, hey, these are pretty good. I of course mentioned the song that Owl God sang. This was written by Chiri Yukie. She was translating for an aunt, and she wrote down her aunt's words into Japanese. So this is, if you get it in English, it's been translated twice already. So you're not going to get the direct concept of what her aunt was telling her. I have a copy, as I said, with me that's been translated by Benjamin Peterson into English. So this is third language it's gone through in one book situation. Another good book, and this one is a little later in terms of the Ainu and out of period, but the conquest of the Ainu lands, ecological and culture in Japanese expansion, 1590 to 1800, by Brent L.L. Walker. Professor Walker or at the time he wrote this, was at Montana State University in Bozeman. I think that's Bozeman. I know it's Bozeman where he was working at, because I was really tempted to go to Bozeman just to be under him and do this. It's a really good book, and it talks about, as I said, this colonialization that the Japanese had on Ainu and, cultural assimilation as well. There's also a lot of free stuff, and I actually mentioned a couple of books. The Ainu Folk Tales by Basil Hall, and Alone with the Hairy Ainu by Arnold Henry Salvage Landor. Those can actually be found on Project Gutenberg, which is a free website that takes out of print, out of copyright books and makes them available to people. The Felt Knowledge is also a free access book. If you go on to one of those thesis dissertation free websites that show you free thesis and dissertations, that is on there as well. All the things that I put on here on the right hand side, those are all theses that are available for free, so you can read up on them. Now the only other thing for free on here, because I did put another thing that you had to pay for, is if you want to actually go and learn Ainu, the language learning app drops. It drops. I didn't put an S there. It actually drops. It should put an S if you ever go look it up. They offer Ainu learning lessons. It's actually a pretty good app. I just don't care for the katakana style of Ainu writing. As I said, the katakana makes it difficult, especially if you are traditionally a Japanese speaker and you've learned Japanese. You're going to look at it and think, oh, it's pronounced like that. And then you realize there's a K right at the end or a P at the end. And that's one of the reasons I hate katakana Ainu language and how they need to really go for the Roman characters and stuff like that. The only other thing that you would have to pay for to access is Golden Kamui by Satoru Noda. It's an anime and a manga, and it takes place after the Sino-Japanese War, so think 1910s, 1920s. And the one thing why I'm recommending it, the writer actually worked with a professor of Ainu studies at Hokkaido University in Sapporo to make sure that he was including Ainu culture in it correctly. And there's a lot of little fun Ainu tidbits in it, and I think it's actually a good story. So, I had to give it a shout out since it's one of my favorite anime right now. Now, if you guys want to, we can watch some YouTube videos. We can listen to, go into food or something because I made put videos out there. Is anybody interested in watching a video for a hot second?
Sure.
Let's do it.
Anybody have a preference on what they want to watch? We could talk about clothing. We could talk about food. I got, dancing and music. Not really the history video. You can watch the history video later.
I like food.
You like food? Okay, so this is actually from the anime Golden Kamui, but it shows the techniques on how they made the kitatap, kitatap. And it's that thing that I told you is like a meatball consistency. So we'll go ahead and watch this because I thought this scene was perfect for showing how this works. Okay, just make sure you guys can see it, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I'll introduce these characters really fast. The Japanese guy, his name is Sakimoto. He's a former soldier. Tsukimoto, sorry, his name's Tsukimoto. He's a former soldier. And the girl's Ainu, and her name's Asopra. And you can kind of see some of her clothing. Because this takes place after Japanese colonialism was going on, her clothing is actually a mix of Japanese and Ainu. Her overtop is Ainu, and her headband and necklace are as well as her knife. But the undertop is actually a kimono. So this is not a representation for this outfit of the Ainu culture. So 1 second while I get back onto my PowerPoint. There we go. So yeah, fun little thing. As I said, if you get a chance to watch that anime, it's pretty good. It's not kid appropriate. I will admit that. So if you decide to watch it, I do not recommend having children around because there's nothing like you don't see any true nudity. Like you might get a butt crack, but you don't see any nudity. It just has, one of the characters is a kid, and so his name is Penis. So, there's commentary like that. So, we're pretty much like right on time for ending this class. Anybody have any questions?
I
No
don't think
questions?
I don't think any questions from us.
Okay. Um, if you guys get an opportunity, I'd recommend, kind of going through and watching these videos later. There's some pretty interesting stuff. I mentioned the bear ceremony, and of course, I have a video from 1931, and this is one of the last bear ceremonies they got to do, but I'll show you like all that singing and dancing. The salmon kamui ritual, that one's a modern video. That is them reviving the rituals. As I said, there was a lot of colonialization that happened, and this is, of course, as I said, my area of Ainu knowledge, where they essentially had a lot of Westerners that came in, and a lot of the practices that were put on the Ainu was very similar to what they did as Native Americans. And so right now they're having that cultural revitalization now that they are recognized as a formal group. So as I say, definitely, like, if you do stuff, like, definitely study up on them. They're pretty heavily studied now, luckily, in universities. Like most people, if they do an anthropology class or they study anthropology, they're going to at least hear about the Ainu, you know, at least once, just as much as they're going to hear about Kennewick Man, who I mentioned at the beginning of the video. Okay, well, if we're all done, that settles that. Again, if you want to review this, we'll be on YouTube. And I hope you guys all have a good night.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, welcome.